Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 4 player game Glass Road from designer Uwe Rosenberg. Glass Road comes with all of the components that you see here, including 4 different sets of specialist cards in the player colors, 4 landscape boards, 40 total good tokens, a player aid for the solo game, a first player marker, as well as 4 production boards. The game also comes with a double-sided building board, 51 total small landscape tiles, 24 large forest tiles, and 92 total building tiles. To begin setup, place the building board in the center of the table. Make sure to use the side that's appropriate for your player count. Then, each player should be given a landscape board and a production board, ensuring that the longer arrows on each of the production boards is pointing straight up. Then, place all of the goods markers on the appropriate spaces on the production boards, matching their icons. Then, on each player's landscape board, place the appropriate forest, pit, pond, and grove tiles on their pre-printed spaces. After the players have placed all of the appropriate tiles on their player boards, gather about half of each of the different building tiles, shuffle them, and place them in a face-down stack to the left of the main building board. Fill in each of the empty spaces on the building board with the appropriate number of buildings from the respective stack. Make sure that there are a few extra of each of the pond, grove, and pit tiles. Give each player a deck of 15 specialist cards in their preferred player color, and then randomly determine a first player and give them the first player marker. A game of Glass Road is played over a sequence of 4 rounds known as building periods. In each of the rounds, players will be taking turns to gain or spend goods and build buildings. Buildings will come in one of 3 different types: processing buildings that will give players some type of trade or conversion, immediate buildings that will give players a one-time benefit of some type, and bonus buildings which will provide players some sort of in-game scoring condition. Throughout the game, players will be gaining and spending resources from their production boards to take actions and buy buildings, etc. The amount of goods that a player has of each particular type is represented by the number next to the region where that good marker currently is. So for instance, this player currently has 2 food on this wheel, 1 clay on this wheel, and 0 charcoal and bricks. When a player gains or spends a resource, they move the corresponding marker up or down to reflect that. So for instance, if a player were gaining food, they could move either food marker up to represent how much food they've gained. If at any point a player were to gain goods in such a way that both of the brown sections on either of the production wheels are empty, the wheel would immediately be rotated so that at least one of the brown sections is no longer empty. By doing this, the player has reduced the amount of certain goods that they have and gained a refined good, as you can see here. In this instance, they lost some charcoal and clay and gained 1 brick. This process is how production is represented and happens automatically. And they can't do any actions, including anytime actions, in between this process of production. It's important to note that players will always rotate this wheel until one of the 2 brown sections is full with a good. So in this particular example, the players would continue to rotate until this 3 is now occupied by a good. So in this way, you can see that you'll never have more than 3 of a refined good, whether it be bricks or glass. If the player were then to spend a brick later on their turn, this would once again create a situation where both brown sections are empty, so the player would immediately rotate until that's no longer the case. At the beginning of each of the 4 building periods, each player will secretly choose 5 specialist cards from their deck. These 5 cards selected will dictate the type of actions that a player takes in each building period. And in each building period, there will be 3 card playing rounds where a player will pick a card from their hand to play in front of them. Once players have selected the 5 specialist cards they want to play during this particular building period, each player will then select a card to play during this card round and place it face down in their play area. This process will happen a total of 3 times during the building period. Then, beginning with the start player and then going in clockwise order, each player will reveal their played card one at a time. So in this example, the start player would reveal their card that they've chosen, the charcoal burner. If any other player has the charcoal burner in their hand when it's revealed by a player, that player has to put it in one of the two indentions on the right side of their player board and play it out of turn. After this has been done, each card would be resolved one at a time, starting with the player who initially revealed the card. It's important to note that players only have to reveal and play the card in one of the indentions on the right side of their board if it was still in their hand. So if another player has played the charcoal burner as one of their face-down cards and it just hasn't gotten to them yet, they don't have to reveal it this time. And that's very important, and we'll detail why in just a moment. Each card has two potential actions that can be taken when it's revealed and played. If a player is the only player to reveal a card, they would get to take both of the actions on the card. But in an example like we have here, where another player has the card and was forced to play it in one of their indentions out of turn, each player can only choose one of the two listed options. It's also important to note that some cards will have a cost that has to be paid before you can take their action. In this example, the cost would be paying 1 wood by moving that particular good marker. When paying the cost to take an action, you have to pay 1 wood regardless of whether you're taking one or both of the actions on the card. And when taking the action on the card, you can pick either the top or bottom if you're only getting to choose one action to take. In this example, both options are the same, but when you have a card that shows an option like this, choosing the top or bottom might matter to you. We'll look at what each card does in more detail in a moment, but many of the card's actions will give players resources, either outright or depending on what types of features they have on their boards. After both of these players have revealed and resolved their actions for these particular cards, it would then be the next player's turn in a clockwise direction to reveal their card. In this particular example, no other player has this card in their hand, so this player is able to resolve both the top and bottom action. Using the pond builder, this player would be allowed to first gain a pond and then gain goods based on how many ponds they have on their board. Now that this player revealed their card and took the appropriate actions, it's then the third player's turn to reveal their card and take an action. The third player reveals that they also selected the charcoal builder. It's important to note that even though this player had the charcoal builder out as their selected card, whenever the first player revealed the charcoal builder, they didn't have to play it out of turn because it wasn't still in their hand of cards. It was face down, planned to be used as their main card later. In that particular example, the player didn't have to reveal their card and play it. So now on their turn, they're the only player that's revealed this card and would get to take both the top and bottom action. And it's important to note that even though they're gaining 3 charcoal twice, they still only have to pay 1 wood to take both of these actions. The next card round in this particular building period would then take place with all players selecting one of the cards remaining from their 4 or 3 cards in hand, depending on if they had to play a card out of turn. And then the second card round would then be resolved once again, starting with the first player revealing their card and then taking the action. Play will continue in this way until 3 card rounds have been played in each of the 4 building periods. At the end of a particular card round, players will refill any empty building spaces that may be on the main board, place any of their remaining or played cards back into their main deck. They can always choose from all 15, and then the first player marker would then be passed to the next player in a clockwise direction. Now that we've looked at the structure of a building period and each of the card rounds within a building period, let's look at all of the specialist cards in detail and get a good idea of what they do. Many of the specialist cards, when played, will give players some type of resources. Some of the cards, like we mentioned earlier, require players to pay an entry cost of goods to be able to take 1 or 2 of the actions. So in these 2 examples, a player would have to pay 1 wood and then they could gain either 3 or 6 charcoal, depending on if they're the only player who revealed this card. This card would require a player to pay 1 water to gain 2 or 4 clay, depending on if they're the only player who revealed the card. Some cards require players to remove forest tiles from their board. So in this particular example, the player would have to remove any one of the forest tiles from their board, and then they would be able to gain 1 or both of the listed resources, depending once again on if they were the only player to reveal the card. So for instance, this player would remove 1 forest tile from their board, and then they could choose to either gain 2 charcoal or 2 food, or both if they were the only player to reveal that card. And when players reveal any type of tile from their board, whether it be forest tiles or one of the pit, grove, or pond tiles, this will then create new spaces where players can build buildings. Some cards will allow players to gain new landscape tiles. For instance, this card doesn't have any entrance fee, and it would allow a player to gain a new pond tile, as well as gaining either sand or water depending on how many pond tiles they have on their board. Whenever players gain a new landscape tile, they can place it on any empty space in their board. It's important to note, however, that once placed, it can never be moved to another space on the board. There are ways to remove landscape tiles, which we'll look at in just a moment, but once placed, it can't be moved around, essentially. This card would also allow a player, like I said, to gain a sand or a water depending on how many pond tiles they have. So in this particular instance, if this player were allowed to take this bottom action after they placed another pond tile, they would then gain either 3 water or 3 sand. It's also important to note that this player could have, instead of placing a pond tile, just used the bottom action if, say, for instance, they weren't the only player who revealed this card and just wanted to get the listed resources if they had to choose one of the 2 actions. As you can see, there are a number of other cards in players' decks that do similar things to the ones that we just looked at. For example, this card would allow a player to gain 1 grove and then 1 wood, and the bottom action would allow them to gain a food or a wood for each grove that they have on their board. With the fuel collector, a player would have to pay 1 water as an entrance fee, and then that would allow them to gain 2 wood as the bottom action, and 1 charcoal per card they have left in their hand as the top action. And it's important to note that this is only cards that they have left in their hand yet to be played in this current building period, not cards left in their total deck. This card would provide a similar ability as the Forest Manager, where you would gain a pit and 1 clay, and or a number of sand or clay depending on the number of pits you have on your board. These 2 cards provide similar abilities to ones that we've looked at, either straight goods or goods and then goods depending on how many particular tiles you have, after paying their fees, of course. The rest of the cards in players' decks allow them to either reserve or build building tiles. The Feudal Lord, for instance, allows players to gain a private reserve of buildings that only they can build. When resolving the Feudal Lord's ability, a player would draw 1 each from the top of the 3 building stacks, and then place those 3 buildings face up in their play area, and only that player can build those buildings for the rest of the game. The other ability of the Feudal Lord would be providing 1 clay and 1 wood. In a similar way, these cards would allow players to either gain new landscape tiles or wood after removing a forest, where the supplier will provide a somewhat unique ability, where the player chooses 2 of one particular resource to gain, and then each other player would gain 1 of that selected resource as well. So for instance, this player could choose 2 clay, and then each other player would gain 1 clay as well. Anytime an ability provides one of these symbols right here showing a building tile, a player is able to build a building into their play area. When constructing a building, players are able to select any of the buildings on the face-up building board, or any of the buildings from their private reserve. In this instance, we'll say that the player is planning to build the pottery right here. They would select that building from the player board, they would select that building from the main board, and this space wouldn't be refilled right away. That doesn't happen until the end of the building period. When a player chooses to build a building, they can place it on any of the empty spaces in their player board. And when building buildings, players have to pay the cost listed on the left side of the building to be able to play that building onto their player board. So in this example, this player would have to lose 2 wood, 1 glass, 1 clay, and finally 2 bricks. That would be the full cost for this building. This is a nice building to have, however, as it provides players points at the end of the game for their clay. Other buildings may provide players one-time benefits right away, like this storage building. For instance, this building would provide the player with 2 bricks right when they build it, and would be worth 1 victory point at the end of the game. Whereas other buildings might provide players some type of trade that they can make as an anytime action throughout the game. We'll look at anytime actions here in a moment after finishing the explanation of our specialist cards. It's also important to note while talking about buildings that there are 3 pre-printed buildings on each player's player board that will give them points at the end of the game for particular goods that they have. Each of these cards showing this building symbol would allow a player to build 1 building as that action. So every time this player were to play one of these cards in the future that showed a building symbol, they could build 1 building per action shown, either from the main board or their personal supply. once again paying the costs and placing it on an open space if they have one available. Players would continue to play through building periods, resolving 3 card rounds per building period until 4 total building periods are played. One special situation to specifically note is in a 3-player game. At the end of the 3rd round, instead of the first player marker simply going in a clockwise direction, the first player marker would be given to the player who has the fewest buildings on their board. So in this example, it would go straight to this player, skipping this player next in turn order. If there are multiple people tied who have the fewest buildings, it would go in clockwise direction to the next tied person. After 4 building periods have been played, the game would end and end-game scoring would take place. Before we look at end-game scoring in detail, let's take a look at the anytime actions that players can take, even outside of their turn. Many buildings that players might build will be the blue buildings that show some type of trade or conversion. Players can utilize these buildings' abilities as many times as they want, as long as they finish one anytime action before moving on to the next. So for instance, this player, as an anytime action, could remove one of their pond tiles to then gain 2 food and 1 water. This player could also, as many times as they want, spend 1 water to gain 2 clay. This might be particularly helpful near the end of the game whenever they're trying to gain as much clay as possible because of their pottery. Players can also, as an anytime action, always remove one of their particular landscape tiles from the board without gaining anything. This will free up spaces that players may want to use to build more buildings. So for instance, a player could just remove one of their groves if they wanted to, which would then create a new space for new buildings to be built. It's important to note that while these landscape tiles can be removed at any time, forest tiles have to specifically be removed by cards. They can't be taken off as an anytime action. At the end of 4 building periods, all players would be able to use their processing buildings as many times as they want before completing final scoring. So in this example, this player will want to gain as much clay as they possibly can to maximize the scoring for their pottery and potter's parlor buildings. They could complete this conversion twice, spending 2 water to gain 4 clay, and then they might resolve this ability to gain another water to then once again gain more clay. This player would want to be careful which of these ponds they're removing, as this building would provide players points for adjacent ponds. Removing this pond they would be fine, however, because this pond would have been diagonal and not adjacent. After gaining the 2 food and 1 water, the player could then spend that water again to gain 2 more clay. This would max out their clay supply, which will help them score the most points possible for these 2 buildings. Players would then score points based on all of the buildings that they have on their board. For instance, this player would gain 7 points for this building, and then 3 points for this building. The player would gain 4 points for these 2 adjacent pond tiles, 2 points for this adjacent pit, 2 points for these 2 adjacent buildings, 1 point for their remaining glass, 1 point for their remaining brick, and half a point for their remaining sand. The player with the highest total score would be the winner, and if there was a tie, the victory would be shared. If playing the game with 2 players instead of 3 or 4, players would play according to the normal multiplayer rules, but the following changes would need to take place. Instead of placing cards face down in front of them and revealing one at a time like in the normal 3 or 4 player game, beginning with the start player, players would simply take turns playing cards face up in front of them until one player has run out of cards. Since players won't have placed any cards face down, if any player reveals a card face up in front of them, it will automatically be in the other player's hand if they've selected it for the round, so they would then have to play it on the right side of their board in one of their 2 indentations. In this way, there will be more interaction between the 2 players and allow for more competition. This will continue in the 2-player game until one player has run out of cards, at which point the building period would end immediately. Most of the time in the 2-player game, players will have 1 or 2 cards left over, but if a player should have 3 cards left in their hand when one player runs out of cards, they can play one of those 3 cards and use both actions as if they're using it by themselves. Alright everybody, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you have any questions still about how to play the game, please make sure and comment below or email us directly at thedicey@gmail.com. You can always connect with us on social media or by visiting our Board Game Geek Guild. And if you find this content helpful or you enjoy what we're putting out, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you haven't already to get notified whenever we put out new content. Alright, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.